of romance, Jane Austen and the weather. And it felt particularly appropriate this morning when I looked out of my window and saw an inch of snow that I was giving this talk today. Thank you very much, Marlene and Sharon, for inviting me to do so. So the talk's going to be in roughly 3 parts. I'll begin with a little bit of historical context. Then I'm going to talk a bit about how Jane Austen uses the weather to further her plots in ways that you'll all be extremely familiar with. And then finally, I'm going to delve into some slightly newer things, I hope, that I've been working on recently about the philosophical context, really, of Northanger Abbey and the extent to which weather might play a part in that. So I hope you'll bear with me as I lead you through those 3 parts of the talk. So I'll begin by saying that in the late spring and early summer of 1816, Jane Austen was at work revising the manuscript of Susan, which of course, as you all know, would go on to become Northanger Abbey. She was also writing her final completed novel, Persuasion, completed on the 6th of August of 1816. In that extraordinary year without a summer, so called because of the peculiar climatic conditions that caused heavy rains and average global temperatures to plummet, resulting in failed harvests across Europe and severe famine in parts of Ireland, Jane Austen was therefore working on 2 novels in which I think weather plays a central and key part. On the slide, though, you see a quotation from a writer who is not Jane Austen, although of course he is discussed in Persuasion, George Gordon Lord Byron. And this is his wonderful poem, Darkness, also written in 1816. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless. And the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of this their desolation, and all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light. So that was published in The Prisoner of Chillon by John Murray in 1816. And I've put it here really to sum up the atmosphere of that year, since the lines remind us of the extent to which the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 really did have an effect, not just on crops and harvests, but also on artists and writers. For those who aren't very familiar with Byron's poem Darkness, it's both an amazing discussion, I suppose, of metaphorical and spiritual darkness, but also a really great description of what it was like to look outside in the summer of 1816 and see days that seemed like nights, and nights continuing on through the summer. Anyway, so the eruption of Mount Tambora, I'm just going to talk about for a moment for those who aren't completely familiar with what happened. So during 1816, that is, and for several years afterwards, the sun was engulfed in a constant red haze that kept the daylight from penetrating to the Earth's surface. This haze came from the eruption of Mount Tambora, located on the island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies, off the coast of Indonesia. In April of 1815, this massive mountain exploded in an apocalyptic fashion, losing most of its height and killing almost everyone on or near the island. Huge amounts of ash, dust, and chemicals shot straight into the stratosphere near the equator, quickly covering the northern hemisphere and the rest of the planet. The ash and gases reflected much needed sunlight away from the planet, causing the climate to cool. This cooling then caused disastrous effects on all life on the planet. It would be years, in fact, before these clouds of ash and sulfur dissipated from the atmosphere, warming the Earth once again. And a number of art historians have noted the peculiar quality of the light in paintings of 1816. And this picture by Constable, of Weymouth Bay in 1816, and you'll remember, of course, who meets at Weymouth, Frank and Jane and Emma, is a good example of the extent to which the name of A Year Without a Summer was merited. As you can see in this picture, the sky is entirely black and light's entirely blocked out. John Crome's painting, the next on my slide, this is a windmill near Norwich, also of 1816, demonstrates the extraordinary sulphurous colour of the skies there. Anyway, my point really is that the historical correspondence of the revision of Northanger Abbey, the writing of Persuasion, and The Year Without a Summer might be no more than coincidental. But in this talk, I'd like to consider the ways in which Austen uses key scenes of stormy weather to structure both novels. Beginning with the topic of rain and wind in Persuasion, I hope to show how weather dictates crucial plot developments in that novel before turning to the storm scenes in Northanger Abbey. which in my view, Austen deploys to illuminate her heroine's metaphorical coming of age, as she moves from viewing the world through the prism of Gothic melodrama to a more sober and empirically determined understanding of human beings. And I'll go on to explain precisely what I mean from that in a moment. So, as I think we all know, Jane Austen's final novel, Persuasion, documents a second chance at love. Just a quick summary of the novel for those who need a refresher, although I'm sure none of you do. Anne Elliot, persuaded out of marrying Frederick Wentworth at the age of 19 because he's too poor, meets him again 6 years later after he's made money during a successful career at sea. He's now looking for a wife, and he believes himself to be willing to take anyone except for Anne. He believes he's resentful towards Anne and no longer in love with her, but as the novel progresses, we see him fall in love with her once again. Although there are obstacles in the way in the shape of another young lady, Louisa, and Anne's extremely snobbish family. Today, I'm mainly interested in the ways Austen uses the weather to bring about key events in that plot, although of course there's so much more to say about Persuasion. But I want to begin by saying that Persuasion isn't alone among Austen's novels in this, and I'm going to give us possibly the most famous example of how someone uses the weather to forward the plot, and this is of course in Pride and Prejudice, when Mrs. Bennet schemes to keep Jane at Netherfield. So she says, "No, my dear, you had better go on horseback because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night." I won't read through the whole of the dialogue, but this is just on the screen to give you a bit of a refresher. "That would be a good scheme," said Elizabeth, "if you were sure they would not offer to send her home." And it's interesting, I think, that Mrs. Bennet has really thought this through. "Oh, but the gentlemen will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs." Jane, "I had much rather go in the coach." "But my dear, your father can't spare the horses," so on and so forth. Then, of course, Jane does have to stay at Netherfield, and Mrs. Bennet takes all the credit for it, as if she has her kind of hotline to the Almighty and has actually caused the rain. "That was a lucky idea of mine indeed," said Mrs. Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Jane, of course, gets the cold, she has to stay there, and that, of course, is not only what furthers the romantic plot between Jane and Bingley, but also between Elizabeth and Darcy. So the rain's the indirect cause of two important romance plot points there. The weather starts a train of events that will dictate the romantic plot of Pride and Prejudice. Similarly, in Sense and Sensibility, as we all know, it's a fine day after 2 days of rainy weather that tempts Marianne and Margaret out onto their walk on the hills, and it's rain which brings Marianne tumbling to the ground and Willoughby into their lives. As you remember, it starts to rain, so Marianne starts rushing down the hill and falls over and twists her ankle. So this is just the fine weather tempting them out, and this is where the false step brings her suddenly to the ground, and Margaret can't help her, reaches the bottom in safety. In the same novel, the settled rain at Cleveland, followed by twilight walks in the grass wetted by the rain, is again the cause of an illness in a young woman, as it was in Jane Bennet. And this time it's Marianne's near fatal putrid fever, as it's described in the novel. The walking, as well as sitting in her wet shoes and stockings, Jane Austen always practical, had given Marianne a cold so violent, as though for a day or two trifled with or denied, would force itself by increasing ailments on the concern of everyone. So again, the weather, Marianne's foolishness, walking out in the rain, causes the illness, which of course sets in train Willoughby's visit to explain his actions, but it also helps us to see how Colonel Brandon is a truly nice person in coming to her aid and bringing her mother to her. And I think myself that that's one of the reasons why eventually Marianne will accept him. Anyway, I'm just giving examples here of how weather forwards the plot. It's the snow at Randalls that renders Emma vulnerable to Mr. Elton's proposal, ensuring that they have to travel home together tete-a-tete in the carriage, another wonderful scene that I love. It's the hot sun that gives Fanny a headache from cutting roses in Mansfield Park, and that allows Edmund to demonstrate his tender solicitude for his cousin at a time when we're beginning to think he's forgetting her. I could go on, but suffice to say at this point, I think that Austen very often uses the notoriously fickle British weather to further her plots. It's also important to note, in relation to the historical context of its production in the darkness of The Year Without a Summer, 1816, that Persuasion contains proportionally more rain, wind, and darkness than any of her other novels, once allowances is made for its relative shortness. I've done a little statistical analysis there. And I'd like to say also that Anne's frequent tendency to lowness, which I guess we would now characterize as perhaps low-level depression, is quite often exacerbated by poor weather. And I'm not going to attempt some kind of strange retrospective diagnosis of a fictional character, but it does have some of the characteristics of seasonal affective disorder. However, I'll just quickly turn back to the question of whether defining plot to begin the analysis of persuasion. And as you can see in the quotation I put on the slide, in Persuasion, it's the fine wind playing over Anne's face and bringing a glow back to her cheeks that first makes Frederick Wentworth think of her again. We're told she was looking remarkably well, her very regular, very pretty features having the bloom and freshness of youth restored to them by the fine wind which had been blowing on her complexion and by the animations of eye which it had also produced. And this is where, of course, her cousin, Mr. Elliot, first sees her and first begins to think seriously of her. And it's the moment when Captain Wentworth is roused to jealousy by that glance too. So Captain Wentworth looked round at her instantly in a way which showed his noticing of it. He gave her a momentary glance, a glance of brightness, which seemed to say, that man is struck with you, and even I, at this moment, see something like Anne Elliot again. Further on in the novel, though, it's rain that defers their final understanding. Anne, as you'll remember, is in Milsom Street, Bath, with Sister Elizabeth, the hanger-on Mrs. Clay. Wentworth comes in and offers Anne an umbrella, but it's already been arranged that because of the rain, Anne will be accompanied home by her cousin, Mr. Elliot, while Elizabeth and Mrs. Clay go home in the carriage. And you probably remember that in the BBC adaptation of Persuasion, Wentworth makes quite a play of having bought an umbrella because he's provided for the terrible climate of Bath. When Mr. Elliot returns to pick up Anne, and Wentworth sees that Mr. Elliot is the very man whose glance of admiration to Anne had rekindled his own interest in her, he jumps to the conclusion, aided by gossip he hears in the shop, that Anne and Mr. Elliot will soon be engaged. So actually rain at this point defers the plot. It keeps us in suspense so that we don't quite know what's going to happen. But it's also rain that finally brings them together again. We're told Anne couldn't keep her appointment punctually. However, the weather was unfavourable. She grieved over the rain on her friend's account, this is Mrs. Smith, and felt it very much on her own before she was able to attempt the walk. But it's because Anne is unable to keep the appointment with her invalid friend, Mrs. Smith, because it's too rainy to attempt the long walk to Westgate Buildings where Mrs. Smith lives, that she instead goes to the White Hart, where she encounters Captain Wentworth. Already in love with her, but thinking she's going to marry her cousin, Mr. Elliot, as we have seen. At the White Hart, he overhears that conversation where she expresses the view that women love longer and more hopelessly than men. You'll remember that astonishing conversation where she's talking to Captain Harville about how women, because they don't have business to take them out of the house and to keep them occupied, love last and longest. Anyway, at the writing table at the White Hart, Frederick Wentworth writes that letter that brings them together in the following chapter, probably the most romantic piece of writing in any one of Austen's novels, if not in any novel in the world. In themselves, none of these incidents are particularly surprising, but in every case, they illustrate Austen's ability to make the weather stand for something important, to do something important. And it's perhaps a hallmark of her brilliance that they're so natural as mainly to go unnoticed. But in Persuasion, Austen does a little more than simply using weather to further the plot. Persuasion is famously Austen's most autumnal novel, both in terms of Anne sees her own life, but also because it's mainly set in autumn. And some of her most tender descriptions are of autumnal scenes and autumn weather. Contrasted, for example, to the white glare of Bath in September, is the influence so sweet and sad of the autumnal months in the country. We learn that Anne takes great pleasure from the view of the last smiles of the year upon the tawny leaves and withered hedges, and from repeating to herself some few of the 1,000 poetical descriptions extant of autumn, that season of peculiar, inexhaustible influence on the mind of taste and tenderness. To some extent, then, Austen's using what's usually called the pathetic fallacy. That is, the attribution of human feelings and responses to inanimate things or animals, to set the mood of Persuasion. Now, that pathetic fallacy is a key strategy of poets, and no doubt one of those poetical descriptions extant of autumn is probably Keats's Ode to Autumn. But here's just a brief definition of pathetic fallacy. the pathetic fallacy as a figure of speech in which the natural world or part of it is treated as though it had human emotions. So the phrase weeping willow is a classic and standard example of the pathetic fallacy, since it suggests that the willow is sad or dejected, which of course isn't true, it just looks that way to our eyes. So in that quotation that I just gave you, it is the smiles of the year upon the tawny leaves and withered hedges, and that's the pathetic fallacy there. Just to remind you of Keats's To Autumn, that's the famous season of mists and mellow fruitfulness that Anne may or may not be musing upon as she walks. So having just thought briefly then about plot and mood and the ways in which weather features for both of those in Persuasion, I'd like to pass on to Northanger Abbey to demonstrate the ways in which in this novel, a heroine's response to stormy weather allows us to understand the novel's philosophical commitments. So we're moving here from plot and mood to philosophy, but please don't be put off. So Northanger Abbey, as you all know, is a parody of the Gothic novels popular in the 1790s. It tells the story of Catherine Morland, a kind but naive girl of 17. She's invited to Bath by friends, where she makes the acquaintance of Henry and Eleanor Tilney, and is invited by their father to visit the family home, Northanger Abbey. And I've put on the slide Catherine's first sight of Northanger Abbey in the 2007 TV series. The general believes Catherine to be rich, she isn't, so he encourages Henry's courtship of her. Catherine's thrilled to be invited to stay in the Abbey because she's obsessed with Gothic novels and hopes it will be like what she's read of in books. Catherine thoroughly enjoys imagining herself into a Gothic romance filled with storms, ancient buildings, and mysteries. Taken over by her Gothic imaginings, as you'll remember, she begins to believe that she's living in a Gothic romance and starts to suspect General Tilney of having imprisoned and then murdered his wife some years before. In a scene of éclaircissement, though, she's finally persuaded by Henry Tilney that life isn't really like Gothic romances, and she feels properly ashamed of herself. However, the general then discovers that Catherine isn't rich after all and turns her from his door, thus to some extent justifying her belief in fact that he's a Gothic tyrant. Catherine returns home, heartsick and mortified, but luckily Henry eventually comes in search of her and they marry and live happily ever after. So that's the plot summary, if you like. And much of the comedy of Northanger Abbey comes from Austen's parody of familiar Gothic tropes and scenes, but she also uses Catherine's obsession with the trappings of the Gothic eventually to make some serious points. And this is where I wish to begin my argument about Northanger Abbey and Austen's use of the weather to debunk superstitious thinking and to encourage a rational empiricist mindset. You'll remember the wonderful scene on the way to Northanger Abbey where Henry Tilney is amusing himself by teasing Catherine with a description of the Abbey drawn straight from the pages of one of her favourite Gothic novels. Is it not a fine old place, says Catherine, just like what one reads about? Henry, and are you prepared to encounter all the horrors of a building such as what one reads about may produce? Have you a stout heart? Nerves fit for sliding panels and tapestry. Henry continues by describing the gloomy passages, the ancient housekeeper, the gloomy chamber, too lofty and extensive with only the feeble rays of a single lamp, the tapestry hung walls, the bed presenting a funereal appearance. And he goes on, how fearfully will you examine the furniture of your apartment? Then describing a ponderous chest which no efforts can open, the portrait of some handsome warrior whose features will so incomprehensibly strike you that you will not be able to withdraw your eyes from it. Dorothy, the ancient housekeeper, will, he tells Catherine, give you reason to suppose that the part of the abbey you inhabit is undoubtedly haunted, and informs you that you will not have a single domestic within call. Catherine responds, oh, Mr. Tilney, this is just like a book. It cannot really happen to me. I'm sure your housekeeper is not really Dorothy. Sorry, on the slide was the bit I was just reading before. I've slightly got out of sync with my slides. I'm sure your housekeeper is not really Dorothy. Well, what then? Yes, this is Catherine, Mr. Tilney, how frightful, this is just like a book. So I suppose I'll pause as people might need to read through the slide, but I just pause to say that Henry's really playing on Catherine here. He knows what she's been reading. He himself knows the Gothic well enough to kind of parody it with this wonderful on the hoof description of what's going to happen to Catherine. But he's also setting in train a series of associations in her mind that will go on throughout the novel to become more and more serious. But he goes on at this point. Nothing further to alarm perhaps may occur the first night. after surmounting the unconquerable horror of the bed, you will retire to rest and get a few hours unquiet slumber. But on the second or furthest, the third night after your arrival, you will probably have a violent storm. And here we finally come to the weather. Peals of thunder so loud as to seem to shake the edifice to its foundation will roll around the neighbouring mountains, and during the frightful gusts of wind which accompany it, you will probably think you discern, for your lamp is not extinguished, one part of the hanging more violently agitated than the rest. Okay, Catherine, no indeed, I should be too much frightened to do any such thing. Henry continues a little longer, but then he's too much amused by the interest he had raised to be able to carry it further, and Catherine grows ashamed of her eagerness and begins earnestly to assure him that her attention had been fixed without the smallest apprehension of really meeting with what he related. Now, the point of all this is, as I said, a mockery of the Gothic mode, particularly the Radcliffean Gothic. It's an extended riff on the idea that the Gothic novel is, by this stage, so formulaic that Henry can extemporize an entire novel from existing tropes at the drop of a hat. For our purposes today, though, I want to focus in on one particularly well-known Gothic feature, stormy weather. By the time Austen was revising Northanger Abbey in 1816, storms and tempests were almost synonymous with the Gothic. As Henry suggests a little earlier, no self-respecting Gothic heroine would expect to encounter a new place in fine weather. Instead, Gothic novelists often used the pathetic fallacy to the full, making foul weather reflect the foul deeds that it often concealed. And I've just given one example out of so many on the slide. This comes from a work by the most famous of all 18th century Gothic novelists, Anne Radcliffe. It's from her A Sicilian Romance. You'll remember that it's actually the Mysteries of Udolpho that Catherine and Isabella are obsessed with, but this one here happens to be from a Sicilian Romance, which was published anonymously in 1790. It's the part of the novel where the wicked Duke is trying to recapture the virtuous heroine Julia after she's escaped from her tyrannical father's castle of Mazzini. The night grew stormy. The hollow winds swept over the mountains and blew bleak and cold around. The clouds were driven swiftly over the face of the moon, and the Duke and his people were frequently involved in total darkness. They had travelled on silently and dejectedly for some hours and were bewildered in the wilds when they suddenly heard the bell of a monastery chiming for midnight prayer, and so on. When Catherine finally reaches Northanger, she's disappointed, as you know, to find that it's a well-appointed and largely modern building, with its ancient history as an abbey visible only in the Gothic arch of the old windows. The general points out the various improvements he's made, and Catherine is impressed, but doubts she would even have known she was in an abbey. And this is her first intimation that her imagination might lead her astray, when we hear that the windows really only have a Gothic form. They're clear of dirt and cobwebs, and the difference to her is very distressing. Nonetheless, when Catherine goes to bed that night in a truly Gothic fashion, a storm is raging, and this really encourages her in some Gothic fantasies. The night was stormy. The wind had been rising at intervals the whole afternoon, and by the time the party broke up, it blew and rained violently. You'll notice the verbal echoes in common with the Radcliffe extract that I was reading just a moment ago. Catherine, as she crossed the hall, listened to the tempest with sensations of awe, and when she heard it rage round a corner of the ancient building and close with sudden fury a distant door, felt for the first time that she was really in an abbey. Notice that personification of the wind there. It's the wind that's closing with sudden fury, a distant door. Yes, these were characteristic sounds. They brought to her recollection a countless variety of dreadful situations and horrid scenes which such buildings had witnessed. Of course, Catherine only knows about these dreadful situations and horrid scenes from her reading of the Gothic novel, not from history or anything like that. Such buildings had witnessed and such storms ushered in, and most heartily did she rejoice in the happier circumstances attending her entrance within walls so solemn. She had nothing to dread from midnight assassins or drunken gallants. Henry had certainly been only in jest in what he told her this morning. How glad I am, she says, that Northanger is what it is. If it had been like some other places, I do not know that, in such a night as this, I could have answered for my courage. But now, to be sure, there is nothing to alarm one. Catherine then perceives an old-fashioned lacquered cabinet and won't rest until she opens it, but it appears mysteriously locked. At this point, we're told, the wind roared down the chimney, the rain-beaten torrents against the windows, and everything seemed to speak the awfulness of her situation. Catherine, in other words, is enormously enjoying terrifying herself, and the weather is coming to her aid in doing so. She finally manages to open the cabinet and finds a roll of manuscript inside it. At this moment, of course, her candle goes out, and a violent gust of wind rising with sudden fury added fresh horror to the moment. In the bright light of day, we're told a bright morning had succeeded the tempest of the night, Catherine eagerly collects the rolls of manuscript and discovers to her intense mortification that the ancient manuscript she had been sure would contain the secret to a mystery is, in fact, pathetically simply a laundry list. In his excellent book, Jane Austen and the Enlightenment of 2004, Peter Knoxshaw suggests that Jane Austen was strongly engaged with the ideas of the Enlightenment, particularly the sceptical tradition within it. And he says, my brief in this book is that Jane Austen is a writer of centrist views who derives in large measure from the Enlightenment, more particularly from that sceptical tradition within it that flourished in England and Scotland within the second half of the 18th century. While celebrating reason, scientific method, and social reform, the Anglo-Scottish school dwelt on the irrationality of human nature, tempered the optimism of the philosophes with an emphasis on the limits of individual heroism, and instilled a distrust of dirigisme and of the doctrinaire. So I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this, but just a very quick introduction to Enlightenment thought and why this might matter. The Enlightenment, which incidentally is a contested term, I wouldn't like to say it isn't, included a range of ideas which were basically centered on the sovereignty of reason and the evidence of the senses as the primary sources of knowledge. So Enlightenment philosophers commonly rejected all forms of faith-based knowledge, including religious superstition. And this is the key point here for Northanger Abbey and a priori reasoning in favor of a belief in the importance of evidence-based knowledge, and that's what's usually known as empiricism or empirical reasoning. So a priori reasoning is where you have a hypothesis and you try to make your facts fit into that hypothesis. And I think one of the things that Austen's showing us in Northanger Abbey is quite strongly the ways in which, if you have a hypothesis and that hypothesis happens to be false, then whatever evidence that you then think you're accumulating will also be false. It will be leading towards that false hypothesis, but the process leads you into error and misunderstanding and misconceptions. So just as a straightforward example, then in Northanger Abbey, Catherine believes that she's living in a Gothic romance, and all of the evidence that she accumulates about General Tilney, she tries to make fit into her hypothesis that he's a Gothic murderer. And Austen shows us quite clearly, I think through irony, the ways in which she's wrong to do that. So it does seem to me that throughout Northanger Abbey, but particularly in the moments that we've just seen, when a bright morning has succeeded the tempest of the night, when darkness literally gives way to light, obscurity to illumination, and that's of course both metaphorically and literally, I think we can see Austen's belief in empiricism and her belief in the rational method most clearly. And I'll just go on to elaborate on this statement now via a brief discussion of the moment when Henry Tilney realizes that Catherine has suspected his father of the murder of his mother. In order to convince Catherine, Henry scientifically describes her symptoms and refers not only to the observations of medical men, but also to his own observations and his empirical experience. And the key part I've put in bold at the bottom. During the progress of her disorder, Frederick and I, we were both at home, saw her repeatedly, and from our own observation can bear witness to her having received every possible attention which could spring from the affection of those round about her, or which her situation in life could command. He then goes on to recommend that Catherine consult her own judgment and experience before coming to conclusions. He says, consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? So Henry's focus on observation, understanding, as well as education and law, comes straight out of the priorities of the Enlightenment philosophers, as Peter Knoxshaw says. And I do recommend his book. I'm just giving a very, very brief kind of synopsis of his argument there, but it is a really good book. So yeah, it comes straight out of the Enlightenment philosophers. And Austen's approval of this position is, I think, evident when Catherine is entirely convinced by his arguments. And she believes him because she's in love with him, but she does, when she starts to test her observations against her sense of the probable, realize that the story she's built up is really a tissue of nonsense. The next chapter begins, the visions of romance were over. And that's why I put that in my title, actually. Catherine was completely awakened. Henry's address, short as it had been, had more thoroughly opened her eyes to the extravagance of her late fancies than all their several disappointments had done. Most grievously was she humbled, most bitterly did she cry. So that's that idea of visions disappearing, eyes opening, slumber giving way to wakefulness. All of that, I think, gives us a really good sense of how Catherine is beginning to understand properly how observation, how evidence should be put together in a way to make sense of the world around you. So that Catherine is learning to judge the world through experience and observation rather than imagination, fantasy, and visions of romance is beautifully demonstrated by the use of a second storm in Northanger Abbey. Towards the end of the novel, as you know, General Tilney peremptorily orders Catherine to leave his house and insists that she leave the following day without any thought for her comfort or indeed her safety. We're told, heavily passed the night. Sleep or repose that deserved the name of sleep was out of the question. That room in which her disturbed imagination had tormented her on her first arrival was again the scene of agitated spirits and unquiet slumbers. Yet how different now the source of her inquietude from what it had been then, how mournfully superior in reality and substance. And that again is a really key phrase. So a disturbed imagination is juxtaposed to reality and substance. Her anxiety had foundation in fact, her fears in probability. Remember, Henry asked her to consult her sense of the probable. And with a mind so occupied in the contemplation of actual and natural evil, the solitude of her situation, the darkness of her chamber, the antiquity of the building were felt and considered without the smallest emotion. And though the wind was high and often produced strange and sudden noises throughout the house, she heard it all as she lay awake, hour after hour, without curiosity and terror. And I think we're being explicitly asked here to compare that first storm and the ways in which Catherine responds to the wind with how she responds this time. And in this particular scenario, despite the stormy weather, Catherine has no more Gothic fantasies. Instead, fact, probability, and actual and natural evil take the place of fantasy, visions, and unnatural evil of the kind popularized in Gothic novels. It's hard to imagine a passage of literature, actually, that more firmly validates Henry's advocacy of observation and understanding over imagination. So just to conclude then with a final thought, Austen structures Catherine's journey from dark imaginings to enlightened understanding between these two storms. During the first storm, as we have seen, Catherine, working on the basis of an erroneous a priori hypothesis that she's living in a Gothic novel, wholeheartedly buys into the pathetic fallacy that associates stormy weather with terror. But by the second storm, she's able to understand the differences between external events such as weather and internal feelings or emotions. Austen's magnificent parody of Gothic tropes thus takes its place in a wider and much more important philosophical tradition that encourages observation, skeptical questioning of observed phenomena, and finally analysis and interpretation of those phenomena against fact. Catherine learns to regulate her imagination by testing her observations against probability and fact, and in so doing, she embraces the empiricist philosophy recommended to her by Henry Tilney. And finally, I suppose I'd say that I don't think this is just the case in Northanger Abbey. I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently. And in every one of her novels that I can think of, although perhaps Emma most obviously, that idea that it's really important not to start with an a priori hypothesis, but instead to allow the facts to emerge from observation and experience seems to me absolutely crucial in all of her novels. So I'm going to stop there, say thank you very much for listening. I will stop screen sharing now. And of course, I would be delighted to hear any questions or observations that anyone might have. Thank you.